Hey, Fiveable friends, welcome to our live stream today. I am your host, Allie Thiessen, and today we are going to be talking about using themes for AP World History. Before we get started, I just want to point out there is a poll we have at the bottom asking what acronym your classroom uses for themes. So we're going to be talking about the themes today. I'm going to be using a couple different acronyms. The acronym that you use really doesn't matter too much. It's just a way to kind of categorize and think about these themes. And so thank you, Sunny, for answering that poll and putting in comments there. If one of the ones that you or your teacher uses isn't on there, put it in comments. So it looks like we have another one, species, which I believe the other E, the two E's probably are environment and economics. Probably the right one. So please go ahead and answer that poll before we get started. I'll introduce myself a little bit. My name is Allie Thiessen. I am a teacher. I'm coming to you live from Germany. And so some of you guys may be up really, really late watching this. So in comments, if you could, let me know where you're watching from. And I know that West Coast is probably about 9 p.m., but here in Germany, it is 6 in the morning. So we're going to be partying until the sun comes up, which for me will be much sooner than for all of y'all. And a lot of my other live streams have been from like 5 p.m. Eastern time. So it's been really, really early for you West Coasters or Mountain Timers. So I wanted to do a live stream that could more get some of my friends from the West Coast and beyond. So welcome wherever you are watching from. So excited to have you in here watching and doing this live review with me today. So just so you know, there are some upcoming live streams that you should tune into, depending on where you're watching from. These 9/18 is probably tomorrow. For me, it's today. But tomorrow night we'll have a live stream about the global Middle Ages. We'll have one about Southeast Asia in the global Middle Ages. We have a study group East Coast time, and then a live stream about developments in the Americas. So what we're starting to get into now that the class has been going on for a little bit, a lot of us have probably been in class at least 2 weeks. Some of us have been in class since the beginning of August. We're starting to get used to history, starting to get used to the content. So now we can kind of dive in a little bit deeper. But this live stream today is going to kind of step back a little bit and be more of an overview and a way to approach the class. And as we're starting to get used to some of the content, knowing the themes is going to be really, really helpful for how you organize, how you study, how you organize, how you write, and how you're going to be thinking about world history. So in today's live review, we're going to go over what are themes, what are the themes for AP World History, a couple of the acronyms that you may hear or get used to seeing, and then we're going to get some practice identifying and working with those themes. So let's jump into it because I got a lot to do today. I'm going to do this live stream about an hour long. So if it's past your bedtime, you can let your parents know just one more hour. I'm studying for AP World History. All right, so let's get into what are the themes for AP World History. So in AP World History, we organize our thinking into units, topics, and themes. And so when we're learning about history and we're trying to organize, we're trying to characterize history in a meaningful way, and it's really hard to do. So when we look at themes, we can look at specific time periods and the importance that it has in different categories of human life, because humans are varied. The human experience throughout world history can impact so many different areas of our lives. And so by looking at the different themes, we're kind of categorizing the events and how they impact different aspects of human life at particular periods of time in history. So the first theme is humans and the environment. This is a theme that I think tends to get kind of overlooked a little bit in AP World History, but it is a really, really important one because it dictates how and where people live and the impact that they have on their area, plus how the area impacts how they live. Theme 2 is cultural developments and interactions. So when we're talking about cultural developments, we're talking about various aspects of culture. Most of these really revolve around religion and belief systems and language and all of those things. Oh, I should point out, do you see in the parentheses how I have next to the names of these themes? That's kind of a coding system that College Board uses. And so if your textbook maybe, or if you have a review book, if it uses those acronyms, it's just referring to that particular theme. Theme 3 is governance. And a lot of the time when we use the acronyms, it'll be a P for politics. But governance can be very, very small, disorganized, or it could be very large, very bureaucratic, lots of different levels, and extremely complicated. And so when we're talking about governance, we're talking about how people are ruled or how people interact with their government. Theme 4 is economic systems. When we think about economic systems at the very base, we're really just talking about trade. And as societies grow more complex, these trade systems are going to also grow more complex. This is going to be a really, really important theme when we start out AP World History class, because our second unit is called Networks of Exchange. And a lot of them are going to be based around trade routes. Well, that at its heart is an economic system. Theme 5 is social interactions and organizations. This one gets often confused with the cultural developments, but when we think about social interactions, I want you to think about like how people live and interact with each other. And then theme 6, this is the new theme for this school year. It's technology and innovation. And so if your textbook or if your study materials don't have technology and innovation, they're a little bit outdated. And if you want to join me, I had a previous live review that you can go back with a premium account and watch on the changes to AP World History, and I have some of that information about the new theme in there as well. So this is just an overview of the themes for AP World History. We're going to dive into these a little bit deeper into what do they mean, because if we don't know what they are, well, we're not really going to use them. Or if the terminology is just a little confusing, I'll give you some ways to think about them a little bit differently. So let's get into each of these themes more specifically. So the first one is humans and the environment. I have 2 pictures on here about how humans interact with their environment. And obviously one of them, the one on the right-hand side, is pretty obvious. You can see they are harvesting. Well, that's how people use the environment. We use it to farm. But we have to also think about the other implications that come with farming. We can talk about over-farming and deforestation, how we are planting over and trying to fertilize more lands. And in the process, we are taking down forests and we're taking down trees and rainforests. And the other image shows a different aspect of how humans interact with the environment. It's more about how humans are shaped by the environment in which they live. And where they live shapes how they live. Because if you live in a desert and you live in a desert, it's very different than living in a lush island. You're going to be living very different lives. You're going to be interacting with your environment differently. And your culture may also reflect how you live in that environment differently. Your economic systems may be impacted by where you live as well. If you live in a very populated city versus living in a very about river valley civilizations, and maybe you guys started with that too, because where you lived, if you have a hydraulic, a water source, and you can channel that water source, you can access the water, the fresh water, and you can begin farming. But if you don't have that, how are you interacting with your environment? Maybe you will be nomadic longer. And so those impact how societies form, how cultures develop because of the environment in which they live. And then, of course, the one that more of the focus is going to be on for the modern class, the class that we have this year, is that it's going to be a lot about how humans have changed their environments. And so when we get into the modern era, thinking about population growth and how huge populations put a strain on resources, and we need to farm and we need to farm more, and that of course can have devastating impacts on the environment. The use of things like chemical fertilizers, all of those things are going to shape and change our environment. And so let's get into some of the examples. And some of these examples are going to be ones that you're going to interact with in units 1, 2, and 3, mostly in your AP World History Modern class. So I try to use some examples of ones that you may have already learned about if your class started pretty early, or ones that you're going to learn about pretty soon. The spread of the bubonic plague in China reduced the population by nearly 50%. This one is a difficult one. That's why I threw it in here, because it actually is a humans and the environment example. When we talk about the spread of diseases, we're talking about the impact on humans in their environments. We're talking about the impact on population and what we call demographics, which is population studies. So when we have booms in population, or we have extreme declines in population, that also impacts our environment, because it impacts how we get our resources and the strain that we put on the environment, because more people obviously are going to put a larger strain on the environment, and fewer people also are going to impact the environment, because there's going to be less of a human strain on those resources, or less farming because of the reduction in human resources. The Columbian Exchange introduced new foods across the Atlantic world and beyond. So that one is about foods. And that's a really important one when we're talking about the environment, because when we introduce new plants, or introduce new animals into the environment, it can dramatically change how we interact and use the environment. It puts an additional strain on resources. And then we can think about some of these foods that came from the Americas and were introduced into the Atlantic world, introduced in Africa or into Europe. And if you're here in comments, if you guys have already learned about the Columbian Exchange, what are some foods, what are some new foods that were introduced either into Europe and Africa, or what new foods or animals were introduced in the Americas? We'll see if you know any of those. So when we introduce new foods, we are changing the natural environment of the place in which we live. Those animals weren't native to those lands, and they're going to put a strain on resources. Or those new foods are going to be cultivated that aren't natural to those areas. Good one. Horses in the Americas are going to have a dramatic impact environmentally, because using them by Native American populations to hunt obviously is going to put a strain on resources like on bison. Introducing things like potatoes to Ireland and being very, very reliant on that one crop. And when that crop failed, of course, we had the potato famine. So those types of things are all about the theme of humans and the environment. Let's do one more example. This one's a little bit later. So if your class started really early and you kind of rushed past 1 and 2 and 3, you may have gotten to these ones already. But this is another one about demography, about population. The agricultural revolution doubled Europe's population between 1750 and 1900. Well, when we have a population that doubles in that amount of time, obviously that's going to put a strain on resources. And what I mean by strain on resources is we got to eat, y'all. We have to eat. Humans have to eat to survive. And where do we get the food? Well, we grow it. And so we need to grow more food to have more people and to sustain larger populations in one area. But another interesting thing that happens with this doubling of European population is more urbanization. Well, think about it. When people move to cities, and if you know anything about the Industrial Revolution, What environmental impact did the growing cities have? What impact did those cities have on the environment? And not just the cities, the factories. What environmental impact did they have? And this, of course, is going to be really, really important when we get to the end of the modern or kind of contemporary era, pollution. When we're talking about pollution and we're talking about environment, of course, that's something that's going to be important for the world, because with pollution, of course, we don't have borders. The pollution can impact so many aspects of society and have long-lasting impacts on other areas of the environment. All right, so that is theme 1, humans and the environment. Most importantly to remember about humans and the environment is I want you to think about it both ways. How the environment impacts people and how people have changed and impact the environment in which they live. So really think about it as kind of a double interaction, humans to the environment and environment to humans. Let's talk now about theme number 2. So theme 2 is cultural developments and interactions. And the big part about this is also interactions, because when we get into our topics that we're starting the year off with, not only are we talking about just these societies kind of in isolation, but we're talking about how they interact with each other. And because they're interacting with each other, they're sharing and spreading their cultural developments. And so this theme is going to be a good one to really start out the year practicing, because cultural developments and interactions doesn't exist kind of isolated in a vacuum. These societies, because of the new networks of exchange, are connecting with each other, and they're sharing and spreading ideas. So what are cultural developments? A lot of times when we talk about cultural developments, we're talking about like belief systems. We're talking about ideas. And of course, we're talking about religions as well. This is going to be a huge theme throughout world history, is kind of the spread of religions, where they develop and then where they go from there. How ideas, beliefs, and religions impact society. There's kind of another interaction that we have here, because how what we think can impact how we interact with each other and how we interact with the outside world. And then the impact of ideas, beliefs, and religions on society, politics, and culture. When we're talking here about the impact on politics, I want you also to be thinking about like how governments use religion to govern. That's going to be an important theme. If we start with like the Islamic world and the Islamic caliphates, how they used religion to govern. Even later when we get into like the gunpowder empires, that's going to be an important one to really focus on, is how are they using religion to govern? How are they using belief systems? When we think about like China, how are they using ideology, not even just religion, but ideology like Confucianism in their society and in their government? And then culture. When we talk about culture, it kind of gets confusing because I don't want to go too much into like technology and innovations, but you can also here think about like art, architecture. You can be thinking about literature and their writing systems, and also their language. And so those things also are a part of theme 2, cultural developments and interactions. So let's get into some examples of cultural developments and interactions. This one is a good one that we'll start out Unit 2 with, about these networks of exchange. This is kind of one of the downfalls of how the modern class starts. It starts in 1200, and so you don't really get a good background about the development of religions. You just kind of jump into them at like their mid or their high point in a lot of areas. So when we talk about Islam, you can kind of go back into looking at how Islam developed and then spread from that initial point of development in Arabia to other areas. But one that you'll learn a lot about in Unit 2 is how Islam spread through trade routes to new areas. So Islam spread to sub-Saharan Africa through trans-Saharan trade routes. So we actually kind of get 2 for 1 here. It's a little bit about economic systems because we're talking about trade. But when people trade, obviously they're bringing themselves with them. And when they bring themselves with them, they stop in these urban centers, they learn and they interact with other people. And through those interactions, religion is also spread. And across the Silk Roads, religion is spread in those ways too. So when we think about trade, we can also think about, and that's just an interaction of people. So we can think about the cultural interaction. What kind of ideas or beliefs or religions are being spread as people interact with each other? The development of diasporic communities like Arab and Persian communities in East Africa. This also has to do with trade. This is more about like the Indian Ocean trade. But when we talk about cultural developments, we can also talk about how cultures interact with each other and how they kind of isolate from each other. So when we think about diasporic communities, we can think about kind of like neighborhoods or areas in which we see pockets of different cultures. And that is true in all areas of the world. We can kind of see these diasporic communities and how they interact with other cultures nearby to them. And then Buddhism developed new branches as it spread out of South Asia. This is another example of one that you really wouldn't get because we kind of start in 1200 about the developments of Buddhism. But in comments, let me know if you know how Buddhism developed or who came up with it or where. If you know anything about the origin of Buddhism, put it in comments, because this is one that you definitely probably would have skipped over in AP World Modern if we started in 1200. I mean, it's just so much further back. But one thing that's going to be important when we start our class, and we're talking about developments in China, developments in East Asia. Buddhism originated in India. Good. And you even got his name, Siddhartha Gautama. As it spread, it gained more of a following outside of India than it ever did in India. There were, of course, practicing Buddhists in India. It kind of reached a high point, but it's always going to be surpassed by Hinduism. But Buddhism spread out of South Asia, out of India, and it got more of a following in areas of East Asia, particularly in places like China. And as it spread, it's going to adapt to the people that it spreads to. When it comes from China to Japan even, we see other branches emerge because it's interacting with the cultures there and they are changing the religion. This is also true when we talk about this is a little bit later in history when we talk about Christianity coming into like sub-Saharan Africa, or we can talk about religions coming into the Americas, creating things that are really more of a amalgamation of different aspects of religion and culture. All right, let's go on to theme 3. This is about governance. This is another really easy one to start with because we jump into 1200 and we're like, all right, who do we got? We got some empires over here. We got some people ruling themselves like this over there with feudalism. And so governance is another really easy way to start. It's also one that is going to have a lot of interactions with these other themes. So when we're talking about governance, we're talking about factors that lead to the formation, growth, and decline of government systems. So when we start and we're talking about empires, Unit 3 is land-based empires. Of course, that big focus is going to be on the theme of governance. But how did these empires, these land-based empires, emerge? Where did they come from? How did they form? How did they get their power? How did they grow? How did they conquer other areas? And then how did they reach their point of decline? How do they start to see cracks in the foundation of their empires? How do they reach their ultimate end where they were replaced by another government system? And so all of those are about governance. How governments administer, including their policies and procedures. This is a good one that talks about kind of other themes as well, because when we're talking about like culture and we're talking about religions, We can also look at, do these governments use religion in a particular way? Are they theocracies, meaning that religion and government is intertwined? Are they having a goal to spread religion or to use religion to unify their peoples? That's another way that government kind of interacts with that cultural developments. And finally, how governments maintain and exercise power over different areas and peoples. Because that Unit 3 is on empires, the big focus is going to be on incorporating dissimilar people into your empire. And that's a big issue. They can go, back to our earliest empires. We're taking new cultures, new societies, new people, and we're trying to bring them into our empire. So how are we going to keep our power over them? Are we going to try to unify them? How are we going to keep our power over these different peoples who may or may not want to be ruled by us? So let's get into some governance examples. This one I think is going to be really easy to kind of identify, because when we're talking about governance examples, if we're talking about empires, we're talking about states, we're talking about city-states, we're talking about presidents. All of those are really easy to stand out about being political and being in the theme of governance. So the Song Dynasty of China revived Confucianism with the expansion of the civil service exams. This one I actually kind of pulled a little bit from that cultural developments, because Confucianism is a cultural development, it's an ideology. But this is about governance, because it's how they're using it to administer their empire. So the Song Dynasty used a religion or an ideological system to expand civil service exams. And civil service exams are going to be part of their bureaucracy, how they govern the area in which they rule. And so that's a big part about governance, is are they using any aspects of culture in that area to administer or to rule over their state? This is an important one as we kind of get into the time period that we are starting with. The dissolution of the Abbasid Caliphate led to the creation of successor Islamic states like the Seljuks and the Mamelukes. Now, when we're looking at this, we're talking about the decline of one and what replaces them. So this obviously at the very base is governance. We're not really saying much about them besides their Islamic states. But what we know here is that one empire is going to fall into decline and then cease to exist. They're going to be replaced by successor states, meaning they're going to be replacing them in those areas. So when we think about governance, we can kind of think of them in kind of like a timeline order. Like we had this state or this empire to this point, and then they're replaced by this one. So that transition of power is going to be an important place to look when we look at governance. What led to the decline of the Abbasids? What led to the rise of the Seljuks? The Inca used the labor taxation called mita to build their vast empire. So when we're talking about labor and we're talking about taxation, that's another one that's governance. This one gets kind of confused when we throw taxes out there because we think more, oh, it must be economic. But taxation is really a government practice, because how we exert our authority over people is we tell them that we're going to tax them and then we're going to enforce it. If you don't pay the tax, maybe you are going to be thrown into prison. And by paying that tax as a government, we use that tax in some way to help our empire. So maybe we tax them coinage, and then we're going to use that to build roads. Or we can use labor taxation by forcing people to give hard labor for a certain number of months. Rather than paying in coin, they're going to pay it to like a physical duty to their empire, using it to build roads. So taxation really is more, if we're talking about using taxation by the government, like governments are issuing the taxes and using the taxation money, it's definitely going to be more about governance. But it could also be economic systems. If we're talking about taxation, like taxation on trade, or reducing taxes on trade, like import tariffs, to encourage more trade, then that's going to be about economic systems. So you kind of have to look at it a little bit closely when you see that taxation. What could it be more of? So economic systems is theme number 4. Theme number 4, economic systems, is about how societies produce, exchange, and consume goods and services. So produce means like how are they growing or getting what they need to survive. Exchange, how we interact with other societies to get things that we don't have. And consume goods and services. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to eat all the goods and services, but we're talking about how we use those various trade goods. So if we trade and get gunpowder, I hope you're not going to eat gunpowder, but you consume gunpowder because you're using it in a particular way. How societies obtain the goods and services they need. And this is the base point of trade. If I don't have something that I need, how am I going to get it? And if there's a neighboring society that has that particular good or service, how am I going to get what I need? Am I going to take it by force, or am I going to exchange for it? And then the impact of the economy on the society. The type of economy that you have, of course, is going to have dramatic impacts on your societies. Because if you are going to introduce a new type of trade good, that's going to impact your society, how your society impacts other people as well. Like gunpowder is a good example of that. Another one that the economy impacts society is think about it through trade. Because if we are engaging in trade, like I said before with the cultural developments and interactions, we are interacting with other people as we trade, and we could be spreading ideas. Well, those ideas are going to have a huge impact on the society that we come from, because introducing new foods or introducing new religions is going to have huge impacts on societies. So here are some examples of economic systems. Trade in the Indian Ocean led to the development of states in the region. Again, kind of overlapping here about government, but the base here is trade in the Indian Ocean. When you are trading over vast areas like the Indian Ocean and you're using things like the monsoon winds for those seasons, you're going to have to rely on cities or hubs of economic trade. So we're going to start to see the development of cities, and these city-states along the coast are going to be developed solely because of Indian Ocean trade. They wouldn't be there to the extent that they were urbanized at that point without trade happening in the Indian Ocean. So states like Kiowa, the east coast of Africa, the development of those states, because they're trying to entice traders to come to those areas and then house them and tax them and get all those good stuff that you can get to develop and grow your empire. And then by there, you get more access to trade goods that you can then trade elsewhere in your region. The decline of the Mongol Empire led to the decline of the use of the Silk Roads. Another good example about states and governance interacting with economic systems. But the Silk Roads is a really important one. I know we didn't cover it in our modern class anymore, but the Silk Roads are not new with the Mongols. The Silk Roads really had their I can't even think of the word origins, when we had the Roman Empire and the Han Empire of China. And because of the extent of the Roman Empire, we had this thing that we called the Pax Romana. It was peaceful to use the Silk Roads. Well, we have something new under the Mongols, kind of a revitalization of that peace and that security while trading across the Silk Roads that we call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. And by having that huge empire across those Silk Roads, it provided a use of good security for middlemen and traders across Asia. And so it allowed the Silk Roads to be used. But when the Mongols declined and the empire faltered, it really saw a decline in the use of the Silk Roads because it was no longer as safe to trade across those great distances. And so instead, we're going to turn to the oceans. And of course, that's going to be a huge turning point in world history, cross-Atlantic trade and oceanographic voyages. Trade led to new forms of credit and banking, as well as the use of paper money in China in the 11th century. So when we're talking about trade and we're talking about exchange, a lot of times early on, we're talking about barter economies where we're exchanging goods for other goods usually. But now that we're into the modern, in AP World History modern, and we're also starting to have other forms of exchange, including coinage, and then the first use of paper money in China in the 11th century. So using things like hard currency, either in minting of coins, using things like gold and silver, or by issuing paper currency is going to create a new economic system, because now we're going to have to kind of put some faith, if we're using paper money, faith into our economic system, because it's really not backed by much. And then credit and banking is another really important thing that we're going to see in our modern era, because using crediting systems, you can now buy things on credit, or you have kind of the emergence of centralized banks where you can get money and get loans. And because we're going to start to see this kind of entrepreneurial spirit and taking out lines of credit and taking out loans from banks to develop new businesses. And those things are going to be really, really important when we get to the modern era, especially when we hit into the Industrial Revolution, will be really, really important. All right, we're almost there, guys. I'm going over these themes, and then we're going to get to the acronyms and the practice questions, which I know is what you're here for. Theme 5 is social interaction and organization. When I think about societies, I want you to kind of think about like how they organize themselves. In a lot of ways, you can think of it as like a triangle or a social pyramid. And if your student, maybe your teachers use these, I know our books sometimes use them as well. But when we kind of pyramid them out, we're talking about portions of the population and their relative kind of importance to the society, that the society views them as important or not. So the top of our social pyramid, maybe we have a very small group of like nobles. And then below them, maybe it is priests. So below them, maybe it's knights. And then we get larger portions of the population, peasants, slaves, and their relative importance to that society, or how the society views them, kind of going down that social pyramid. Another important part about this is the social norms that distinguish each group. So when we're talking about how peasants lived in Western Europe in feudal times, how did serfs live? What was expected of serfs? What were serfs' lives like? We're really talking about kind of these social norms. What was normal for that social group at that particular time? And how the social groups influence politics, the economy, and culture. If we have a huge slave population, what are we using those slaves for? What impact do they have on the economy for that society? If we have a noble class, how is that nobility impacting the government? Are they running the government? Do they have a special sway in the government? Same thing even with religions. What type of religions impact those social groups? So here we go with some examples. This is a great one for that last point there. The caste system in India created strict social classes with no upward mobility. So we're talking about upward mobility. We're talking about like moving up to a higher status social class, or moving down to lower status social classes. That's all mobility. Upward is to a higher social class. And so the caste system in India also has an impact with culture. In comments, if you know what religion impacted the caste system, please put it in comments. So the caste system in India, very strict social pyramid, because we have different castes in society. And of course, the social norms are going to impact that caste. Because they're very regulated. There's only certain jobs that one could do in that particular caste. Feudalism in Europe and Japan distinguished the nobility, the warriors, and the peasant classes. And this one is a really, really interesting one to look at, because feudalism developing in Europe and Japan, very similar social systems in very different parts of the world, and which weren't diffused between each other. It wasn't that they, spread the idea, hey, Japan, you should use feudalism. It's working great here in Europe. But it also creates kind of a social hierarchy, because feudalism is really based on the nobility, the land-owning elite, or in Japan, the daimyo, the land-owning elite. And because you own land, you have a greater social and political importance in that society. Warriors being used to protect, like knights in Europe, or samurai in Japan being used to protect the landed aristocracy in those lands, is going to be really important. And then finally, the peasant classes, which most people would have been a part of. And the peasant classes, of course, are going to have a huge impact on society, because they're the ones that work the land. And without them, the other feudal classes wouldn't have much to live off of, now would they? In colonial Latin America, peninsulares born in Spain dominated politics and social life. This is one that we're going to see when we get to colonization in Latin America. Like the Spanish are going to rely on peninsulares, those people that are going to be born in Spain, that are going to be like the governors. They're going to be the viceroys. They're going to be the ones in charge. And this is going to be a huge impact when we get to Latin American revolutions. Into our later time periods. I don't want to give you a spoiler alert, but a lot of it had to do with this unequal social system where the peninsulares dominated politics and social life. And those Spaniards that were descendants that were born in Latin America, the Creoles, are going to want to upend that social system and put them at the top. Finally, we've reached the new theme 6. This is going to be a really, really important one, because if you guys don't have new resources, which I know my classes don't have new resources because we just learned about the changes and there wasn't time to get new books or anything. And so if your old books don't have these, make sure that you're really paying attention and thinking about this theme, especially when you go to review for the AP test, because you don't want to forget about it because it's new. I feel like it's going to be a lot on the test. I feel like it's going to be used just to catch us if we didn't learn it. So theme 6 is technology and innovation. When we think about technologies, I want you to think about tools, and how tool at the very base of the term is something that you are going to use to do something that you're already doing. So think about like early tools. We're using them for farming. But as time goes on, those technological advances are going to get more and more complex. And so from our early scythe tool for farming in River Valley civilizations is going to become a combine later into our contemporary era. So think about technologies as just tools. We're using them to do things we would already do, like farm. So technological advances that have shaped human societies. So again, looking at the kind of interaction between societies and technology. So if we have very advanced technologies, how are people using them and what are they using them for? The impact of technological advances on human development and interactions. This is going to be a really important one for culture, because if we have a very advanced system of writing, maybe that writing is going to be spread to other cultures. I'm thinking here about Chinese calligraphy, how that's going to be adapted into other cultures that's going to interact with. Or I gave you the example of gunpowder earlier with trade. How is that going to be adapted by the societies that get them? So how is Europe going to use Chinese gunpowder, where they're going to develop new technologies like cannons or rifles, later machine guns and things like that? And then, of course, the consequences of the advancements in technology. I think they put this really in there because of our current contemporary era, what's going on in the world today. Well, of course, we've gone beyond things like gunpowder. We're still using them, but how are we using things like drones even? How are wars being fought differently? What consequences do they have? That's important when we get to the world wars. As time goes on, humans have gotten really, really good at killing a lot of people in a short amount of time, and thinking about things like machine guns or torpedoes. Also thinking about things like nuclear weapons. What kind of consequences do they have? And you can think about the consequences on culture, the consequence on society, the consequence of government, and the consequence on the environment. So you can look at them through different themes as well. So technology and innovation examples. Advances in medicine, mathematics, and literature all took place in the Muslim world. This is kind of where we start off the year learning about the developments in the Muslim world. They had universities, they had centers of learning that other areas of the world did not have at this point. And because of those centers of learning bringing about new ideas, coupling them with restoration of old Roman and Greek ideas and improving upon them. So those are technology and innovation. We're innovating, coming up with new ideas and new ways of thinking about those. So new innovations in medicine, in mathematics, and then from there, they can be spread to other areas as well, and then further improved upon. Gunpowder spread from China to Southwest Asia, where it was used by the Ottoman Empire. Kind of an interaction of technology and governance. We call the Ottoman Empire one of the gunpowder empires, but gunpowder is not from the Ottoman Empire. They got it from China, and they used it to extend their empire and maintain control over the areas of Europe and Southwest Asia and North Africa. The Aztecs developed the Chinampa system of farming. Farming has a lot to do with technology and innovation and kind of the early developments of our states. How are we getting the foods that we need? And how do we access water supplies? I mean, irrigation is very, very important. How do we get fresh water to the farms? How do we get fresh water to our crops? And by developing systems of irrigation or developing things like the Chinampa system, we can have that impact on how we farm, or even terrace farming. Those are all innovations. All right, let's get into the acronyms. Now that we've gone through all 6 of the themes, there may be acronyms that you want to use to remember these by. So I'm going to use SPICE, T, pieces, and inspect. So nothing is really mind-boggling here. Some of them are going to be rewording the theme from what they're technically called just to fit a word. So if you're still just using spice, change it to spice tea, or like species. You can add the E in there, but spice tea is adding that technology to the end because we have 6, so we should have 6 in here. Pieces and inspect. So SPICE T is social interactions and organization, political systems and governments, interactions of humans and the environment, cultural developments and interactions, economic systems, and the T is technology and innovation. Pieces, political systems and governments, innovation and technology, environmental and human interaction, cultural development and interaction, economic system, social interactions, and organization. So that is pieces. And my third one is inspect. So in is interactions of humans and the environment, social interactions and organizations, political systems and governance, economic systems, cultural developments and interactions, and technology and innovation. If your teacher uses a different one, roll with it. Just make sure it has something with the technology and innovation in there, and they may be calling it something different, but make sure that there's all 6 themes in the way that you're going to remember them. All right, now that we've done all of our overview about the themes, let's get some practice. So if you're here in comments or you're rewatching this at home, I want you guys to, for the next few slides, identify what theme is being described. So if you're here watching live with us, in comments, write out what theme is being described in that slide. So we're just picking out the theme. What theme at the very base could this be? So here is our first one. So here we have Aryans in white, non-Aryans in gray, and then Brahmins, priests, Kshatriyas, warriors, Vaishyas, herders, farmers, merchants, craftspeople, Shudras, farm workers, servants, and laborers. So that's in a triangle. That should be a little bit of a giveaway. This one is social interaction and organization. So this one is social interactions and organizations because it has different classes of people. The triangle gave it away. Pretty easy one to start out with. All right, next one. It says the spread of Islam and Buddhism 200 BC to AD 1450. You can see in the key here, it says spread of Islam is that dotted arrow, spread of Buddhism is that solid arrow, and then it identifies the different regions, cities, empires on this map. So in comments or at home, what theme is being addressed in this map? This one is cultural developments and interactions. When we see religions, that should be kind of a dead giveaway that it's about cultural developments. This is a great one because not only it shows kind of origin places, but it's showing interactions because it's showing the spread of those religions. All right, this next one may be a little bit difficult. Let's see how we do. This one here says population by selected regions. So on the side it says population in millions, and then on the bottom it says in the years. And then our key here, the line with the dot is China, the line with the open square is Indian subcontinent, with the closed triangle Middle East, and with the open circle Europe. So kind of seeing like a steady, and then we see it shoot up. We have sharp declines in this. This one is a little bit tricky. What theme is being described here by population? This one is humans and the environment. And if we read into this one a little bit more, any guesses what could have caused that sharp decline in the environment, the population of China and India and Europe in those time periods, 1200 to 1400? What could have caused that sharp decline? Anybody know? It's the plague, the bubonic plague, and originated coming from China. You can see the earlier sharp decline there. And then as it gets into India and then later coming into Europe, that sharp decline is the bubonic plague. So good one. All right, now the last practice ones that we're going to do is they're longer practice questions. These ones, I don't expect you to have a lot of good input on these, because if you just started school and you haven't learned these things yet, you're not going to be able to really put a huge answer out there. But these are ways that you're going to see them on the AP test. So you may be asked in short answer questions or in a long essay question or even a DBQ for you to give specific thematic examples. So it may say, explain the cultural impact of something, or it could say, explain the ways in which this empire governed. Well, those you're going to have to think in the way of themes. You're going to have to think, well, what does that mean? What is government? What does it mean to be cultural? So I want you guys to be thinking about those ways and be able to use the theme to drive what you know about the content. So here is a perfect example that you may see in like a long essay question. Identify and explain one example of how long-distance commerce, obviously I just put one example here to make it short and sweet, of how long-distance commerce brought changes to how societies interacted during the period 600 CE to 1450 CE. This is a tough one. Before we start answering this, let's identify what themes are being addressed in this question. So in comments, what themes are being addressed in this question? And it's more than one. So what themes are being addressed in this question? The first one, it says long distance commerce. Long distance commerce is economic systems. So we need to know something about long distance trade. And then the second part is how trade impacted societies. So that other part here is how it impacted societies. So we need to be using both ways of thinking about the theme. How did trade impact society? So you need to think of examples of things that were spread by trade that had an impact on a particular society in a particular way. So you could be doing this with cultural development and interactions. If you're talking about a religion, if you're talking about through long distance trade, Buddhism was spread. So I want you to be to China. So that's kind of a specific way that you could be thinking about those. For societies as well, you can also be thinking about like how it impacted the creation of like merchant communities and things like that. That's going to be more about social, like how people get what they need, and who in what class of society helps people get what they need, like merchants. So this one is a tough one because you need to be thinking in both ways. You need to be thinking about an example of long distance commerce and an impact of that long distance commerce. So this one is kind of a tough one because it requires both themes, and you have to know and think about the themes in that particular way. So we're talking about long distance commerce in this time period. There's a lot of ways you can go. Silk Road is going to be a really good example. And thank you in comments there. Mongol spread the plague through Silk Road trade, which affected many societies like population decline, higher wages for those who survived. That is awesome. Way to go, Sunny. So Silk Roads, you can be talking about trans-Saharan trade routes. We can be talking about Indian Ocean trade. All of those are going to kind of focus your thinking. And then you can work from it two different ways. You can think about it from the society and then work backwards to how trade caused that. Or you can think about something that's spread by trade and then think about how it impacted the society where it went to. And so there's two ways to kind of address it. You can look at it from the view of economics first, or from economics, that trade route second. All right, let's get into our last example of using this content. Compare how the Mongol Empire and the Aztec Empire rose to power and maintained their power. So before we start answering this, of course, what theme is being identified in this question? What theme is here? This one is a dead giveaway because it uses the word empire and it uses the word power. So when we're thinking about empires and power, we have to think about governance. And so this one is kind of an open-ended question. This actually is kind of a tough one. This comes from like I modified it from a very old comparative question that we used to have as our LEQ, where there was some other choices. But what you need to see here is you have to think about how the Mongols rose to power and maintain their empire, how the Aztecs rose to power and maintained their empire, and what was similar or different between them. But here's the thing, how you answer the maintain their power part can actually incorporate a ton of other themes. You can bring up trade, because that is going to be economic. You can bring up taxation. You can bring up technology, what technologies they use to maintain and rise to power. All of those things can incorporate multiple themes and be used as content to answer this question. So if we look at the Mongol Empire, how they rose to power, and the Aztecs, how they rose to power, and we try to find something that was similar, but we can answer it beyond just government. If they used technology in their weapons, for example, to rise to power, that's a way to incorporate the theme of technology into what is just sounds pretty straightforward as a governance type question. So we can use that multiple theme to address that and answer that question. If they both used religion to maintain their power. If one used religion to maintain their power and the other one did not as much, using religion with governance, that's a way that you can use cultural development and interactions in a question that looks pretty much just straightforward about government. So thinking just beyond government into other themes can help you think of other ways to answer the question. And that's a way that I know my students kind of get stuck. When they get questions like this and they go, I don't know anything about the Mongols or the Aztecs, or specifics about governments, how they ruled, come at it from the side. Come at it from a different way. Okay, what else do I know about the Aztecs? What else do I know about the Mongols? And then what impact did the government have on that? Or what impact did that have on the government? And you can come at it from the side rather than just coming at it from the impact of government. And you can interpret it in those ways as well. Bonus, if you're kind of incorporating multiple themes, you may be kind of reaching that higher level thinking that you need to get that elusive last point on the LEQ or DBQ about historical reasoning. All right, guys, good job working on those identifications. I hope you learned about the themes today and how to use them. Make sure that you get a lot of practice identifying your theme during your reading, because one of the biggest mistakes that people have is they hijack their questions. And when I say they hijack their question, if the question is asking you just about economics, and you are bringing something up different and you never connected to economics, then you're not going to earn the point for that. It has to be on the topic. And if it's asking for a specific theme, you have to kind of attack it in the way of using that theme. So you always have to make sure you know what theme is being identified so that we're always making sure that we're addressing the theme. And again, you can come at it sideways and talk about religion, but make sure that you're using it in government. So make sure you bring it back to the theme in the question. I always tell my kids to circle or underline in their prompt if they can identify a theme that's being asked. If there's no direct theme that's being asked in the question and it's almost too open-ended for you and you're like, gosh, I could talk about anything. Well, now you can organize it because you know the themes. So if it just talks about like the impact of the Silk Roads. Well, the impact, well, what am I talking about? Trade? Am I talking about technology? What am I talking about specifically with the impact of the Silk Roads? You can use the themes to subdivide your categories. And it's a great way to do it, to make your kind of body paragraphs. This one, I'm going to talk about the impact that it had on religion. This, I'm going to talk about the impact that it had on labor systems, the impact that it had on the environment. And then you can kind of organize it in that way. If you get really, really overwhelmed with those really open-ended questions, think about them by using the theme. And then the more practice that you get, the better. When you're reading or you're taking notes, use those themes, try to identify the themes, and using those is going to help categorize how you're learning so that if we have to make connections across time, if we have to, say, make a comparison about how humans interacted with their environment in 1200 and then how humans interact with their environment in 1900, you can cross-compare those by working with the themes much easier. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. If it is your evening, go to bed. Make sure you get a good night's sleep. If you are just waking up like me, I hope you guys have a great day. Make sure you follow us on all of our social media channels at Think5able. You can follow me on Twitter at Mrs. Thiessen. Thank you so much for joining me late night, partying till the sun comes up. I hope you guys have a great day wherever it is you are coming from. We'll see you next time. Bye, guys.